Hi, everyone. Welcome to part one of the market revolution and social reform. Before we get into this material, there's a couple of things I want to set up here. First of all, the market revolution and social reform is going to discuss almost exclusively the northern states. Our next topic, the Cotton Kingdom, will talk about the southern states during the time period. So the time period that we're looking at here is roughly 1820 to about 1860. So this portion will cover the northern states. The next topic will talk about the southern states. The other thing I want to tell you about before we get into this topic is I'm really going to leave it up to John Green's Crash Course U.S. History video for this topic to give you the big overview. And then what I'm going to do here in this summary is just highlight some of the points that he's made. So here are questions to think about with this topic. First of all, how did the economy of the northern states change during the period 1820 to 1860? And second, what role did the transportation and communications revolution play in the westward movement of settlers during this period? First of all, recalling John Green's Crash Course U.S. History video, he talks a lot about how the Industrial Revolution begins and what that really means. When we think back to the United States or think back to the colonial period, because of the arrangement between the colonies and the metropole, which was Great Britain, this is definitely a situation where the economy is not encouraging the colonies to develop manufacturing. And so they didn't. And then when the revolution is over, that's when we really start to see the economy of the United States change. And the way it's going to change in this industrial revolution is the United States is going to start to develop factories, particularly with textile manufacturing. Part of it has to do with new technology that's being imported from England, and that includes the power loom and spinning machinery. In 1822, a group called the Boston Manufacturing Company started their own little town. Now, one of the leaders in this company was Francis Cabot Lowell. And so, of course, he named the town after himself. But what he wanted was a factory town that didn't look like other factory towns. He wanted it to be clean with a lot of green spaces, and factory towns tended to be crowded and dirty, kind of gloomy. So he wanted to build this town from scratch and set up the textile manufacturing there. Now, what's interesting about this is that the workers that he hired were mostly young women and girls from the surrounding farms. And the way that he convinced their parents to allow them to come and work for him is, first of all, he offered a very high wage, which was unusual for the time. And the second thing is he made sure that there were clean and supervised dormitories for the girls to live in. This is going to change over the next 20 years. By the time we get into 1840, the Lowell system is made up of roughly 22 factories. So Lowell, Massachusetts ends up being the kind of factory town that Francis Cabot Lowell didn't want it to be. So the wages are beginning to decline as the conditions begin to decline, and fewer farm workers are willing to come and work in the factory. And so the Lowell system starts to use immigrant labor for the first time. When we take a look at this portion of the topic, this is something that John Green's video does very well. He talks about the changing nature of work. I kind of want you to go back to that thought bubble portion of the video where he talks about this changing nature of work because it's so very important to what's going on. Still in the United States, the vast majority of people earn their living through agriculture. But living in a subsistence agricultural kind of setting, it simply means you produce the things that you need to live, whether it's having cows for dairy products, chickens for eggs, growing wheat to make bread, and then maybe you grow a little extra to sell, or maybe you raise a few more livestock than you need so that you can sell. And the idea is you're able then to buy the things that you can't make yourself on the farm. But what's beginning to happen here is that more and more people are moving away from the farms. And here's where it gets kind of interesting, and here's where I think John Green does a really good job, is that with your farm, if you don't work, you don't eat. And the work that you do is really governed by the day and the season. And when we get into factory work or people working outside of the home, that becomes a very different concept. People begin working for wages. And your pay depends on your time rather than the product that you are producing. The other thing that's going on here is the idea of separate spheres. Now, to be clear, separate spheres is not necessarily new at this point, but we really start to see this change taking place in American society, where on the farm, everyone has their job, but they're all working in the same place, essentially. Once we start to see more and more men leave the household to go to work, then what's left in the domestic sphere, the home sphere, is much more feminine. And then men belong in the public sphere, where they work, they conduct business, and they're engaged in the public realm. Once more and more workers begin working outside of the home, we start to see the growth of labor unions. A labor union is an organization of workers. So imagine a situation where you and all of your co-workers come together to negotiate with the owners or the management. We call that collective bargaining. And the reason that labor unions and collective bargaining is important, or are important, is because individually, workers don't have a lot of leverage. They can't force their employers to do anything. Say for example, if I'm the management and you all are the workers, and somebody comes to me and says, "We're not paid enough for the work we do," I could say, "You're annoying and you're fired." But if you all come to me together and you say, "We're not paid enough for the work we do," I could fire you all. But that's really bad business, because then I have to hire a whole new crew of workers. They have to be trained. There's a learning curve. And so it's kind of bad business. And I would be much more willing, or maybe I feel the pressure to be more willing to negotiate with you as a collective than as individuals. And that's where labor unions come into the story of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the problem with this is that early on in the 1800s, labor unions were called unlawful conspiracies, because you all are conspiring against me. It's not until 1842 that a case in the Superior Court of Massachusetts makes the determination that labor unions are not unlawful conspiracies, that they're not illegal. So this allows workers to form unions, and the workers can actually force the company to hire only union labor. Now, the problem here is that labor unions are not going to become very popular until after the Civil War. A key component of the story of the Industrial Revolution is the transportation and communications revolution. Part of the reason why the United States is able to grow so quickly economically is because of the building infrastructure. So today, when we talk about infrastructure, we're thinking about things like highways and airports and seaports. These are all systems that allow us to move people and goods very quickly from one location to another. When we think about roads in this period, they're terrible. I mean, if you're going from Worcester, Massachusetts down to Charleston, South Carolina by land, it's about 1,000 miles. It's going to take you about 75 days to make that journey. So one of the first things that we're going to do is we're starting to see some production of better roads. And this was mostly done by the states. And the way that they paid for this was to make those roads toll roads. So just like what we have today with the toll system that you have to pay to use this road, this is a very similar concept. The other thing that's going to happen here is that the United States is going to take advantage of its extensive river system. When you take a look at a map of the United States, especially the eastern portion, you see these really large river systems. Whether it's the Ohio River or the Mississippi River, it makes transporting goods and supplies easy. But it's not until the first steam-powered riverboats are developed that traffic becomes two-way. The final component is the construction of canals. So these are essentially glorified ditches that are constructed to allow for the movement of goods from one place to another when you don't have these other systems in place. And initially, these are going to be horse-drawn. So a horse is going to be walking along the bank of the ditch, and a barge is connected to the horse that's floating on the ditch. And the horse is able to carry much greater weights if that weight is floating on the water in the ditch. The largest of these was the Erie Canal that was completed in 1828. And we see here on this map that the Erie Canal stretches all the way across New York State. But by far, the biggest change has to do with the construction of railroads. When you take a look at the maps on the left, you can see just how quickly the spider web of railroad systems has expanded throughout the country. Now, what's crazy about this is that we don't really see the first commercial railway in England, the first in the world, until 1825. And the first commercial rail system in the US wouldn't come until 1830. So keep this in mind, that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson never saw a railroad, that these are definitely new and modern things. And then by the time we get into 1860, which is the map on the far right, you can see just how extensively these rail systems have spread out, which means goods and supplies are going to be able to be transported very quickly from one part of the country to the other. Related to this is a communications revolution that is sparked not only by the railroads that can move messages very quickly from one part of the country to the other, but the development of the telegraph. Samuel F.B. Morse, pictured here, developed one of the first electromagnetic telegraphs in the 1840s. And by the time we get into the 1850s and we see the development of wireless telegraphs, we are now connecting cities all over the country with almost instantaneous communication. Both the railroads and the telegraph are going to allow for the expansion of the United States. especially as we develop steam-powered factories, so that factories no longer have to be located near moving water. And of course, take a look at these two maps, the first in 1820 and the second in 1860, paying attention to what we would call today the Midwest, places like Chicago, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Detroit. All of these cities become important transportation connections and factory towns. So to recap here, how did the economy of the northern states change during the period 1820 to 1860? It is the Industrial Revolution, the growth of factories and manufacturing. Many people are moving away from an agricultural system into a factory wage job. And then second, what role did the transportation and communications revolution play in the westward movement of settlers during this period? As we saw in that map related to the railroads, being able to very quickly move people and supplies out west, and keep in mind that like Minnesota is out west, Missouri is out west at this point, you are able to move goods and supplies from the East Coast to the interior of the country very quickly. So stay tuned for part 2 of the market revolution.